Discovering your spouse emptied your joint account hours before you plan to leave them feels like drowning while someone holds your head underwater and smiles. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I was sitting in my car outside the courthouse, divorce papers folded neatly in my purse, hands shaking as I stared at the imposing building. After 18 months of planning, saving every penny I could hide, and gathering evidence of my husband's lies, I was finally ready to walk away from the marriage that had slowly suffocated me for 7 years. My phone buzzed with a text from my bank. Account balance, -$47. My heart stopped. I refreshed the app 3 times, convinced it was some kind of glitch. Our joint savings account, which had contained nearly $38,000 the night before, was completely empty except for an overdraft fee. I called the bank immediately, my voice cracking as I spoke to the representative. She confirmed what I already knew but couldn't accept. Yesterday at 4:47 p.m., my husband had withdrawn the entire balance. Every dollar we'd saved over the years. Every cent I'd contributed from my part-time job while he worked full-time. The emergency fund we built together. The money I'd been counting on to rent an apartment, pay the divorce attorney, and survive the transition back to independence. The courthouse suddenly felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. Without funds for legal representation, without money for a deposit on an apartment, without any financial cushion whatsoever, I felt trapped in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. I drove home in a daze, knowing I'd have to face him, knowing he'd probably act like nothing had happened. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, scrolling through his phone with that casual indifference that had become his default expression around me. The same man who used to bring me coffee in bed, who once drove 4 hours to surprise me at work with flowers, now felt like a stranger wearing my husband's face. I asked him about the money, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up with genuine confusion, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. Then his expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, cold calculation mixed with what almost looked like satisfaction. He told me he'd moved the money to protect it from my reckless spending habits. The same woman who clipped coupons, bought generic brands, and hadn't purchased new clothes in 2 years was apparently financially irresponsible. The next few days blurred together in a haze of panic and desperate problem-solving. I couldn't afford the divorce attorney I'd consulted with months earlier. I couldn't put down a security deposit on an apartment. I couldn't even afford to fill up my gas tank without overdrawing our checking account, which he'd somehow restricted so I could only withdraw $50 per day. I started staying late at work, not because I had extra tasks, but because going home meant facing the suffocating reality of my situation. My coworkers began to notice my distress, though I tried to hide it behind forced smiles and excuses about being tired. The woman who sat next to me, someone I'd barely spoken to beyond polite small talk, started leaving little bags of homemade cookies on my desk. She never said anything about them, just left them there like tiny gestures of kindness in an otherwise dark time. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed next to my husband, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how someone could sleep so peacefully after destroying another person's escape plan. The worst part wasn't even the financial manipulation, it was the realization that he'd known exactly what I was planning. He'd watched me secretly save money, watched me research apartments online, watched me prepare to leave, and he'd waited until the perfect moment to trap me. 2 weeks after the bank account incident, I discovered something that changed everything. While doing laundry, I found a crumpled receipt in his jeans pocket from a casino 3 towns over. The date was the same day he'd withdrawn our savings. The amount matched almost exactly $37,800 in chips purchased. My hands trembled as I stared at that piece of paper. All those years of his business trips that seemed to happen more frequently. The phone calls he'd take in the garage. The way he'd become defensive when I asked about our finances. The mysterious credit card statements that he claimed were work expenses. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. I drove to the casino that weekend while he was supposedly visiting his mother. The parking lot was massive, filled with cars from multiple states. Inside, the atmosphere was overwhelming: flashing lights, constant noise, the smell of cigarettes and desperation. I'd never been in a casino before, and the whole environment felt alien and frightening. I approached one of the floor managers and explained my situation. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who listened patiently as I described my husband and the transaction. She couldn't give me specific details about his gambling activities, but her expression told me everything I needed to know. She gently suggested I might want to contact someone who specialized in gambling addiction issues. The drive home was surreal. I felt like I was seeing my entire marriage through a new lens. Every unexplained absence, every mood swing, every time he'd been unusually affectionate after disappearing for hours, it all connected to this secret life I'd never suspected. The man I'd married wasn't just controlling and manipulative, he was actively destroying our financial future to feed an addiction he'd hidden from me completely. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of confronting him directly, I started documenting everything. I photographed the casino receipt. I began tracking his movements more carefully. I started saving screenshots of our bank statements and credit card bills. If I was going to escape this marriage, I needed evidence of what he'd been doing with our money. Update 1. 3 weeks have passed since I discovered the casino receipt, and my life has become something I never imagined. I've been living like a detective in my own home, gathering evidence while pretending everything is normal. The emotional toll is exhausting, but I've learned things about my husband that make me feel like I never really knew him at all. Last Tuesday, I followed him when he claimed he was going to help his friend move furniture. Instead, he drove straight to the same casino where he'd spent our savings. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 4 hours, watching the entrance, wondering how many times he'd done this before. When he finally emerged, he looked defeated in a way I'd never seen. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale, and he sat in his car for almost 20 minutes before driving home. That night, he was unusually affectionate, bringing me flowers and suggesting we order takeout from my favorite restaurant. The guilt gestures I'd always attributed to him working late or being stressed suddenly took on a sinister meaning. Every kind act was apparently his way of managing his own shame after losing money we couldn't afford to lose. I've been staying strong by focusing on small victories. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, one he doesn't know about. I've been depositing my paychecks there instead of our joint account, telling him my employer switched to a different payroll system that required new banking information. It's a small lie, but it's given me a sense of control I haven't felt in months. My coworker, the one who leaves cookies on my desk, finally asked if I was okay. We ended up talking for 2 hours after work in the empty office building. I didn't tell her everything, but I shared enough for her to understand I was in a difficult situation. She offered to let me stay in her guest room if I ever needed a place to go. Having that safety net, even from someone who's essentially a stranger, made me feel less alone than I had in years. The most shocking discovery came last weekend when I decided to dig deeper into our financial records. I found statements for credit cards I'd never seen before, all in my husband's name but connected to our address. The balances were staggering, over $60,000 in debt spread across 5 different cards. Cash advances, casino ATM withdrawals, and charges to online gambling sites I'd never heard of. I realized our entire financial situation was built on lies. The savings account he'd emptied wasn't just our emergency fund, it was probably the last money we actually had. We're not just broke, we're drowning in debt I didn't even know existed. The house we live in, the cars we drive, the lifestyle we maintain, it's all funded by credit cards and deception. The worst part is how good he's become at hiding it. He still goes to work every day, still pays the basic bills, still acts like a responsible adult managing our household. But underneath that facade, he's systematically destroying any chance we have at financial stability. Every month that passes, we sink deeper into a hole I'm not sure we can ever climb out of. I started having panic attacks 2 weeks ago. They come without warning, usually when I'm doing something mundane like grocery shopping or watching television. Suddenly, I can't breathe, my heart races, and I feel like the walls are closing in. I've never experienced anxiety like this before. It's like my body finally understands what my mind has been trying to process, that my entire life is built on unstable ground. The hardest moments are when he's being the man I married. Last Thursday, he spent an hour helping me fix a leaky faucet in the bathroom, joking around and acting like the partner I fell in love with years ago. Those glimpses of who he used to be, or who I thought he was, make everything more confusing. It would be easier if he was consistently awful, but these moments of genuine connection make me question everything. I've been researching gambling addiction online, trying to understand what I'm dealing with. The stories I've read are heartbreaking and terrifyingly familiar. Families destroyed by lies and debt. Spouses who had no idea their partners were living double lives. People who lost their homes, their retirement funds, their children's college savings to an addiction that consumed everything in its path. The casino manager I spoke with gave me the number for a support group for families affected by gambling addiction. I've been carrying the paper around for weeks, but I haven't called yet. Part of me isn't ready to admit that my situation is serious enough to need that kind of help. Another part of me is afraid that talking to other people who've been through this will confirm my worst fears about how this story ends. My husband asked me yesterday if something was wrong. He said I seemed distant and distracted lately. The irony of him expressing concern about my emotional state while actively destroying our lives wasn't lost on me. I told him I was just tired from work, and he suggested we take a weekend trip somewhere relaxing. The same man who's gambling away our future wants to spend more money we don't have on a romantic getaway. Update 2. I'm writing this from my coworker's guest bedroom at 2 a.m. because I can't sleep and I need to process what happened tonight. Everything changed in the span of about 4 hours, and I'm not sure whether I should feel terrified or relieved. This evening started normally enough. My husband came home from work around 6, we ate dinner together, and he settled in to watch television while I cleaned the kitchen. Around 8:30, his phone rang, and I heard him answer it in that cautious tone he uses when he doesn't recognize the number. From the kitchen, I could only catch fragments of the conversation, but his voice got progressively more agitated. I heard him say something about needing more time, then something about a payment plan. When he hung up, he was pale and sweating despite the cool temperature in the house. I asked if everything was okay, and he said it was just a work call about a difficult client. But 20 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time, he took the call in the garage, but our house is small and the walls are thin. I could hear him pleading with someone, promising he'd have money by Friday, asking for just a few more days. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. The credit card debt I'd discovered wasn't just about past gambling losses, he was still actively borrowing money, and now someone was demanding payment he couldn't make. The phone calls weren't from credit card companies. They were from people who don't accept late payment fees as resolution. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock at our front door. Not a doorbell ring, not a gentle rap, a loud, insistent knocking that echoed through the house. My husband's face went white, and he told me to stay in the kitchen while he answered it. I could hear voices through the door, male voices that sounded calm but firm. They weren't yelling or threatening, but there was an edge to the conversation that made my hands shake. After about 10 minutes, my husband came back inside looking like he'd aged 5 years. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. That's when everything came spilling out, not because he wanted to tell me, but because he couldn't hold it together anymore. The credit card debt was worse than I'd discovered. Over $90,000 spread across 7 different cards, all maxed out. He'd been taking cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on others, creating a cycle that was impossible to maintain. But the real problem was the money he'd borrowed from people who don't report to credit agencies. He'd started borrowing from what he called private lenders about 6 months ago. People who loan money to gamblers when banks won't. People who charge interest rates that would make credit card companies blush. People who expect their money back on schedule, with no exceptions for hardship or bad luck. The men at our door tonight weren't there to hurt him, but they were there to make it clear that his payment schedule wasn't negotiable. He owed them $12,000 by Friday. Money we absolutely don't have. Money he can't borrow from anywhere else because he's exhausted every conventional option. As he explained all of this, crying in a way I'd never seen him cry before, I felt something unexpected. Not sympathy, not anger, but a strange kind of clarity. This wasn't my problem to solve. This wasn't a situation I could fix with love or patience or understanding. This was the inevitable result of choices he'd made repeatedly, over months and years, while deliberately hiding the consequences from me. He asked me to help him figure out what to do. He wanted to sell my car to raise some quick cash. He suggested I could borrow money from my parents, who live on a fixed income and have been generous enough to help us in the past with smaller emergencies. He even mentioned the possibility of taking out a second mortgage on our house, using the equity we'd built up to pay off his gambling debts. That's when I told him I was leaving. Not tomorrow, not next week, but tonight. I told him I'd discovered the extent of his gambling months ago, that I knew about the casino receipts and the secret credit cards and the lies he'd been telling me about where our money was going. I told him I'd already found a place to stay and that I wouldn't be contributing another dollar to cleaning up the mess he'd created. His reaction was a mixture of panic and anger I'd never seen before. He accused me of abandoning him when he needed me most. He said I was being selfish and cruel, that a good wife would stand by her husband during his darkest moment. He promised he'd get help for his gambling addiction, that he'd never set foot in a casino again, that we could work through this together if I just gave him one more chance. But I'd already given him chances he didn't know about. Every day I'd stayed in the marriage after discovering his lies was a chance. Every night I'd pretended not to notice his deception was a chance. Every time I'd chosen to hope he might change instead of protecting myself was a chance. I packed 2 suitcases with essential items while he followed me around the house, alternating between apologies and accusations. He couldn't understand how I could be so heartless, how I could leave him to face this crisis alone. But I wasn't leaving him to face a crisis, I was leaving him to face the consequences of his choices, consequences that would destroy me too if I stayed. The hardest part was walking away from the house we'd bought together, the place where we'd planned to build our life. But I realized that life had been an illusion for longer than I wanted to admit. The stability I thought we'd created was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. The future I'd imagined was never going to happen, not with someone who prioritized gambling over everything else we'd worked for. Now I'm lying in a bed that's not mine, in a house that belongs to someone who's shown me more genuine kindness in the past month than my husband has in the past year. My coworker didn't ask questions when I showed up at her door with suitcases and tears. She just made up the guest bed and brewed a pot of tea. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if my husband will find a way to pay back the money he owes or what will happen if he doesn't. I don't know how long it will take to untangle our shared finances or whether I'll be held responsible for debts I didn't know existed. But for the first time in months, I'm not carrying the weight of his lies. I'm not pretending everything is fine when it's falling apart. Final update. It's been 6 months since I left, and I'm writing this final update from my own apartment, a small 1-bedroom place that's nothing fancy but feels like a palace compared to the prison my marriage had become. The journey from that night at my coworker's house to where I am now has been harder than I expected but also more healing than I thought possible. The first few weeks were the worst. My husband called constantly, sometimes crying and begging me to come home, sometimes angry and blaming me for abandoning our marriage. The calls started before 7 a.m. and continued past midnight. He showed up at my workplace twice, causing enough of a scene that my supervisor had to ask him to leave. He sent flowers to my coworker's house with cards that alternated between romantic declarations and guilt trips about how I was destroying our life together. I had to get a restraining order. The woman who used to make excuses for his bad moods and rationalize his controlling behavior had to go to court and explain to a judge why her husband couldn't be trusted to respect her decision to leave. It felt surreal, like I was talking about someone else's life, but the judge granted the order without hesitation after hearing about the financial manipulation and harassment. The money situation was even more complicated than I'd feared. Because we were married, I was legally responsible for some of the debt he'd accumulated, even though I'd never seen the bills or authorized the spending. I spent 3 months working with a financial counselor to understand what I could and couldn't be held liable for. The good news was that most of the gambling debts weren't in my name. The bad news was that our house, which I'd assumed we owned together, had been used as collateral for loans I'd never known about. I ended up declaring bankruptcy. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was the only way to get a fresh start without spending the next decade paying for my husband's addiction. My credit score is destroyed, and I'll be rebuilding my financial life from scratch, but I'm doing it honestly this time. Every dollar I spend is money I actually have. Every bill I pay is for something I actually need or want. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago. My husband didn't contest it, probably because he was dealing with his own legal issues by then. The private lenders he'd borrowed from weren't as patient as I'd expected. When he couldn't make the payments, they took action that involved more than just phone calls and house visits. He ended up having to sell the house quickly, at a loss, to pay back what he owed. I don't know where he's living now, and I've made peace with not knowing. The most unexpected part of this whole experience has been discovering how strong I actually am. I spent years believing I needed him to survive, that I couldn't manage finances or make important decisions on my own. But I've been doing exactly that for months now. I found this apartment, negotiated the lease, set up utilities, bought furniture at thrift stores and garage sales. I've created a life that's entirely mine, funded by money I earn and decisions I make. My coworker, who I now consider one of my closest friends, helped me see that what I went through wasn't just a bad marriage, it was financial abuse. The isolation, the control over money, the lies about our financial situation, the way he withdrew our savings to prevent me from leaving, all of it was designed to keep me trapped and dependent. Understanding that helped me stop blaming myself for not seeing the signs earlier. I've been attending a support group for people affected by gambling addiction, and it's been incredibly helpful. Hearing other people's stories made me realize how common my experience actually is. There are so many people who've been where I was, confused, broke, and convinced they were somehow responsible for their partner's destructive choices. The group has taught me that loving someone with an addiction doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to enable their behavior. Work has been a source of stability throughout all of this chaos. I was promoted last month, partly because I've been more focused and productive without the constant stress of managing my husband's moods and lies. I have energy for projects and relationships that I didn't have when I was spending every day walking on eggshells. My colleagues have been incredibly supportive, and I've realized that keeping my marriage problems secret was just another form of isolation. I started dating someone new about a month ago. It's nothing serious yet, but it's been good to remember what it feels like to be with someone who's honest about basic things like where they're going and how they spend their money. He's patient with my trust issues and doesn't get defensive when I ask direct questions about things that would have caused huge fights with my ex-husband. It's amazing how different a relationship can feel when it's built on transparency instead of secrets. The hardest moments still come without warning. Last week, I was at the grocery store and saw a couple arguing quietly in the cereal aisle about whether they could afford name brand instead of generic. The woman had that look I remember from my own face, tired, stressed, trying to hold everything together while her partner made decisions that affected both of them. I wanted to tell her that it gets better after you stop trying to fix someone else's problems, but I also remembered that I wouldn't have been ready to hear that advice when I needed it most. I've learned that leaving wasn't the hardest part, it was accepting that the person I'd married either never existed or had been gone for longer than I wanted to admit. The man who brought me coffee in bed and drove hours to surprise me with flowers was real, but so was the man who lied about thousands of dollars in debt and withdrew our savings to prevent me from escaping. Both versions were him, and I had to accept that the second version was who he'd chosen to become. My therapist says I have post-traumatic stress from the emotional and financial abuse, and that recovery isn't linear. Some days I feel proud and independent and grateful for my new life. Other days I feel angry about the years I lost and the dreams I had to abandon. Both reactions are normal, apparently, and both are part of healing from a relationship that was damaging me in ways I didn't fully understand while I was in it. I've started writing a blog about financial abuse and recovery. It's helped me process my own experience, and I've heard from women all over the country who are dealing with similar situations. Some are still trapped in marriages with partners who control every aspect of their financial lives. Others are in various stages of escape and recovery. All of them are stronger than they realize, just like I was stronger than I realized when I was sitting in that courthouse parking lot staring at an empty bank account. The apartment I live in now costs exactly what I can afford on my salary. I don't have a dishwasher or a garbage disposal or any of the conveniences I took for granted in the house I shared with my husband. But every month, I pay my rent on time with money I earned. Every decision about how to spend or save is mine to make. Every plan I make for the future is based on realistic expectations rather than hope that someone else will change. I'm not sure I'll ever feel completely secure financially again. The experience of discovering that your entire financial foundation is built on lies changes how you think about money and planning and trust. But I'm learning to be okay with uncertainty, as long as it's uncertainty I'm choosing rather than uncertainty being imposed on me by someone else's addiction and deception. If there's anyone reading this who recognizes their own life in my story, I want you to know that leaving is possible. It's harder than staying, at least at first, but it's also the only way to stop being complicit in your own destruction. You don't have to wait until you have enough money or the perfect plan or absolute certainty that you're making the right choice. Sometimes you just have to choose yourself, even when choosing yourself feels selfish and scary and like you're abandoning someone you love. The life I have now isn't the one I planned, but it's honest. It's mine. And after years of living in someone else's fantasy funded by borrowed money and sustained by lies, honest feels like the most luxurious thing in the world.